What if the moment that was sold to us as the most selfless act in Sister Wives history was actually the first move in a long, quiet power shift? What if the tears, the promises, and the words, just a piece of paper, were not the end of a marriage, but the beginning of a strategy? Tonight, we are breaking down a theory so unsettling it could completely reframe everything you think you know about the collapse of the Brown family. Stay with me, because once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it, and the truth may be hiding in plain sight this entire time. Welcome back to the Sister Wives crew, where we look past what the cameras show and listen closely to what is never said out loud. And today, part 1 of this deep dive opens a theory that has been quietly forming for years, a theory that challenges the official story and asks viewers to reconsider everything they thought they understood about how the Brown family began to unravel. And before we move forward, it is important to ground this clearly. What you are hearing is not confirmed fact. It is not a court filing. It is not a news report. It is a speculative reconstruction built from timelines, behavior, financial patterns, and expert style analysis designed to explore a possible explanation for events that have never fully added up. This is a what-if narrative, an examination of breadcrumbs that appeared to form a path. And the reason this theory feels so powerful is because it answers questions that have lingered without resolution for nearly a decade. It begins not with shouting, not with confrontation, not with a dramatic breakup, but with a quiet, emotional moment that was framed as selfless, loving, and necessary. The legal divorce. That moment has been replayed and discussed endlessly, and it has always been presented as an act of sacrifice, a wife stepping aside for the good of children and the unity of the family. And yet, when that moment is viewed not through emotion but through structure, it becomes something else entirely. Because Mary Brown was not simply a spouse, she was the legal foundation of the entire plural system. For decades, she was the name on documents, the signature on accounts, the legal counterpart in business dealings, the stabilizing force that allowed a non-traditional family to function within a legal world that only recognized one marriage. She co-owned property, she co-signed loans, she participated in every major financial decision, and that status was not symbolic. It carried authority, security, and access. And when the request came for her to surrender that status, it was wrapped in reassurance, told gently, framed carefully, minimized repeatedly as meaningless paperwork, something that would not alter her role, her voice, or her stake in the family. And that framing is where this theory takes its first step, because in legal analysis, when someone is induced to act based on assurances, the assurances matter, the promises matter, the context matters. And according to this speculative narrative, those promises were the key that unlocked everything that followed. Because once the legal divorce was finalized, the structure shifted in ways that were subtle at first, but unmistakable over time. The theory suggests that the legal marriage that followed did more than allow adoption. It created a new center of authority, a new axis around which decisions rotated, and that axis no longer included Mary. And here is where the timeline becomes critical, because almost immediately after the divorce, financial behavior began to change. Accounts that had previously required joint authority were altered, new entities were formed, income streams were reorganized, and while the public narrative focused on emotional adjustment, the infrastructure of the family quietly transformed. And this is not unusual in itself. Families evolve, finances adapt, but what raises concern in this theory is the consistency and direction of those changes, because they did not distribute power, they consolidated it. And that consolidation always moved in one direction, toward the legal marriage and away from the woman who had relinquished her status under the belief that nothing would change. And viewers saw the surface effects of this without context: increased distance, less communication, fewer shared decisions, and a growing sense that one household had become central while others orbited at the margins. And when viewers questioned why, the answer was often emotional. It was about trust, it was about pain, it was about betrayal, and that explanation absorbed attention while the structural shift continued unchallenged. And this is where the theory introduces what it calls the distraction narrative, not as a denial of emotional reality, but as an explanation for timing, because emotional conflict became the story everyone discussed, while financial reorganization proceeded quietly in the background. And by the time viewers noticed the imbalance, it was already normalized, and the woman at the center of this story appeared isolated, confused, and unsure of her place. And that confusion was often interpreted as personal weakness rather than the result of systematic exclusion. And this theory argues that interpretation was incomplete because it did not account for power dynamics. And when power dynamics change without transparency, the impact is disorienting and destabilizing, especially for someone who believed their position was protected by trust and history. And this is why the theory does not frame Mary as a victim of romance, but as a participant in a long-standing partnership who made a decision based on assurances that were never honored. And as time passed, the consequences compounded. She remained financially contributing, emotionally present, and publicly loyal, while access diminished, oversight disappeared, and authority narrowed. And the family that once operated through discussion began operating through announcement, and viewers watched this shift occur without being able to articulate why it felt wrong. And that discomfort is what keeps this theory alive, because it offers an explanation that aligns behavior with outcome and suggests that what looked like emotional drift may have been the result of deliberate structural change. And as this part 1 closes, the theory reaches the threshold of its most consequential phase, because the next step involves assets that cannot be softened by sentiment, land ownership, documentation, and leverage. And once those enter the picture, intent becomes harder to ignore, because land remembers names, even when people forget promises. And in part 2, this theory moves fully into that territory, where belief meets paperwork and where the quiet decisions made years earlier reveal their true weight. And once that door opens, there is no returning to the version of the story that says nothing really changed. As we move into part 2 of this speculative deep dive, the theory stops circling emotion and fully enters the realm of consequence, because this is where belief meets documentation and where years of quiet decisions begin to reveal their cumulative weight. And according to this reconstruction, the turning point was not a fight, not a scandal, not a dramatic exit, but land, because land is where intention becomes permanent. The move was framed as a fresh start, a chance to build something lasting together, a shared vision rooted in space, growth, and legacy. And contributions were made in good faith. Money from home sales, income streams, years of shared effort, all flowing toward a collective dream. And on the surface, everything appeared unified. Maps were drawn, dreams were discussed, and each wife was verbally associated with a piece of the future. But ownership is not conversation. Ownership is record. And this is where the theory tightens its grip. Because while financial contribution remained collective, legal control did not. And through refinancing, restructuring, and the leveraging of shared property, the center of gravity shifted decisively and quietly. The theory suggests that the legal marriage became the gatekeeper to leverage, because banks do not recognize intention, they recognize names. And when new loans were secured and assets were positioned, the authority flowed through the only union the law acknowledged. And in that process, some names rose while others disappeared. Not publicly, not dramatically, but on forms, in filings, in structures that most people never see until it is too late. And this is where the realization phase allegedly began, not in a single moment, but in fragments. A document here, a discrepancy there, a question unanswered, and slowly the understanding that the sacrifice made years earlier had not preserved standing, but removed it. And once that realization set in, the past reassembled itself differently, because moments that once seemed confusing now appeared aligned. Decisions that felt dismissive now appeared strategic, and distance that was framed as emotional now looked logistical. And the theory does not suggest sudden awareness, it suggests dawning clarity, and that clarity is often the most painful. Because it forces someone to confront not just loss, but manipulation. And this is why the theory imagines accountability not through confrontation within the family, but through systems that cannot be persuaded by narrative, only by evidence. And whether or not such a confrontation ever occurred, the power of this reconstruction lies in how it explains the final unraveling. Because once someone understands that their contribution has been absorbed without protection, their role reduced without consent, their future leveraged without inclusion, the relationship is already functionally over, and departure becomes not abandonment, but survival. And viewers saw that departure framed as detachment, as bitterness, as withdrawal. But this theory reframes it as boundary setting after prolonged erosion, and the emotional restraint that followed becomes not coldness, but composure. And this is where the story completes its loop, because the same promises that once induced trust now stand in contrast to outcome. And when promise and outcome diverge consistently, intent becomes a question that cannot be ignored. And this theory does not claim to answer that question definitively. It claims to explain why it must be asked, and why so many scenes from later seasons carry an undercurrent of disbelief rather than grief. Disbelief that the story told no longer matches the reality lived. And that is why this speculative narrative resonates, because it does not rely on outrage, it relies on pattern, and pattern is difficult to dismiss. And whether viewers agree fully, partially, or not at all, the exercise of tracing structure alongside emotion reveals a version of events that feels disturbingly coherent. And as this part 2 closes, the theory leaves us not with resolution, but with reconsideration. Because if the collapse of the family was not spontaneous, but procedural, then the most dramatic moments were not the loud ones, but the quiet signatures, the unchecked boxes, the unseen filings, and the most lasting damage was not emotional, but structural. And once that possibility enters the conversation, it changes how the entire story is understood. And that is why this theory continues to circulate, not because it promises certainty, but because it restores agency to questions that were never fully answered. And in doing so, it invites viewers to look again at what they thought they already knew. So now, the question is no longer what went wrong, but when it truly began. Was it heartbreak or was it structure? Was it emotion or was it strategy? This theory does not claim to be final truth, but it forces us to look closer at the promises that were made and the outcomes that followed. And once you connect those dots, the story of the Brown family collapse feels very different. Let me know what you think, because this conversation is far from over.